Hi, everyone. So we're going to get started now with our webinar. Thanks so much for joining us today, and welcome to the Provincial Human Services and Justice Coordinating Committee webinar on bolstering resiliency in healthcare professionals. My name is Tasha Rennie, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. I am the Communications and Engagement Officer for the HSJCC Secretariat. So before we get started, just wanted to go through a few housekeeping items for our presentation today. Just a reminder, our preference is that you join using the listen-only mode so that you're using your computer speakers or headphones for the audio. If you're having issues, feel free to call in using the teleconference line provided in the notes section. Just make sure that your phone, when you join, your phone is on mute. You have to do it manually. Otherwise, some background noise can really disrupt our speakers. So for our presentation today, we'll have a brief period of time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to type them into the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end. So the webinar will be recorded, and the recording as well as the PowerPoint presentation will be emailed to all of our participants after the webinar. We'll also be sending out a brief evaluation survey, so we ask that you just fill that out and help us plan our webinars better in the future. And for anyone who's joining us for the first time today, the Human Services and Justice Coordinating Committee Network is made up of 39 local committees, 14 regional committees, and 1 provincial HSJCC. Each HSJCC is a voluntary collaboration between health and social service organizations, community mental health and addictions organizations, and partners from the justice sector. And our presenter today is Suneet Shergill, and we're very happy to have her here. She's here from the York Simcoe Brain Injury Services, and with that, I'll be passing it over to Suneet.
Hi, everyone. I forget that you are not responding to me, so that's all right. So my presentation today for you guys is on building resiliency within our own selves as healthcare professionals, as the work that we do often can contain a lot of different trauma stories, as well as experiencing any trauma as we're working through supporting others in our respective domains that we work in. So a little bit about me is that I am presenting today from New York Simcoe Brain Injury Services. We are part of Mackenzie Health and in partnership with March of Dimes Canada to provide a behavior consultant, rehab support worker, and other services as case management for people who have suffered brain injury living in York region or Simcoe region. I also teach part-time at Seneca College, and I am also a registered psychotherapist in private practice out in Oakville. That's just a little bit about me. So for human services and justice, I wanted to talk a little bit about your own respective workplaces and have you sort of think about what was some of the criteria that led you to choosing your workplace environment. A lot of the times we look at some of the positive patterns that we may see, and that attracts us initially to a workplace, and then over time we may start to experience some challenging patterns in the workplace as well. So take a moment to think about what initially attracted you to working in the field that you're working in and the workplace, as well as the different challenging patterns that you're starting to notice that might affect how you want to come into work or how you may behave when you are coming in. Some positive patterns that may have initially attracted you could be work flexibility, the camaraderie that's in the environment, the team support. But some of the challenging patterns can also start to occur when there is turnover, when there are changes in structure, as well as difficult stories that we have to hear throughout our work. So as frontline staff, does your job require you to be assertive, make critical decisions under high pressure? Does it require you to be caring at the same time and be kind, dedicated, or empathic? Or Do you have to constantly be flexible in how you're approaching the scene because every day something is changing beyond your control, and yet you have to be exposed to difficult situations and then adapt and be action-oriented towards achieving sort of expectations that may be set by you but may also be set by others. Some of this may be what initially attracts us to the workplace that we're working in, and over time becomes a bit of a pressure to continue being all of these different qualities. That brings me to the topic, which is resiliency. So if we were going to really define it in sort of clinical terms, we're looking at resiliency as the ability to adapt and effectively deal with or adjust or recover from stress and trauma. On the right-hand side, you see sort of the quotes that we use when we're talking about resiliency in lay terms. So using the terms we bounce back, or shifting from surviving to thriving, beating the odds, rallying back. And we hear this in various populations, but a lot of this is to kind of help maintain this healthy level of psychological and physical functioning, even when we're faced in adversity or trauma. The narratives that we start to tell ourselves, the stories about our traumas, they must also consist of steps that were taken to recover or adjust or to bounce back. And often we start with what happened to us or what happened, and we forget a lot of the part of that story is also the steps we take to recover from stress, or the steps we take to adjust to the trauma that is ongoing. So the next point is vicarious resilience. And I like to bring this up because the work that we may do really does test sometimes our ability to handle a lot of hard or heavy material that is presented. But research often suggests that our own personal growth will increase as we witness other individuals grow. And so I have a very simple formula for life, and it might be too simple, but it goes change times chaos will always equal growth. And so when we're able to grow, we have to accept that chaos that's underneath and the changes that life is going to guarantee, regardless if we thought we had all of that bad stuff happen to us in a certain time frame. I often hear stories where they say, you know, I've kind of done my time with all the bad stuff, like when is the good stuff going to continue happening for me? And it becomes this dichotomy. But nothing beautiful really grows in stagnant waters. We really need that chaos and that mud and that murky stuff to help us change and shift perspective over time. And so when we see others do this, we also can internalize a lot of those, that feeling of connectedness, the feeling of hope and optimism. And we see someone who may have had a stroke a few weeks after their retirement, and yet they come in with such an optimistic and hopeful personality. It's very hard to sort of sit there and then be upset that I got to go to work or I have to take care of my kids, because it just gives us a bit of a shift in perspective. I also like to talk about here in this point is if you think about your heroes, if you think about sort of all these based on a true story documentaries or movies that we see, a lot of the times we relate to this because we see that other person going through something difficult and then trying to be the hero in the movie and trying to overcome it and fight the villain. We don't really go and see any movies where there is no villain and that the hero has nothing to do to get through, because we can't relate to that. We can't relate when someone doesn't have that hardship. So we really want to see that in our heroes. Okay, so just some facts about resilience. You can be very resilient in one area of your life, let's say it is the workplace, and not feel so resilient in another part of your life, such as, let's say, parenting or physical health. And that is just the variability, that we all have the ability to bounce back, but we might be doing it just a little bit more in one domain rather than another one. So the point there is that resiliency can really be nurtured. We can really try to create these core skills and help ourselves decide what step we need to take to build ourselves back up when we are being tested. Resilience isn't this, unicorn picture of being really positive all the time and happy-go-lucky and nothing ever gets to you. It's really about noticing that resilience and negative emotions can occur together, that you can bounce back and you can rally against the odds and still feel a little bit of negativity about that, a little bit of resentment towards the situation that you're dealing with. And I relate this back to if you think about the ocean. On the top of the ocean, there's a lot of sort of waves and there's a lot of activity, and that might be sort of our outward appearance of what we're taking in. But underneath, there is that the ocean is actually quite calm. And so if we learn that we can tap into that inner sort of control, we can still experience the negative emotions, but it becomes, again, a shift in perspective. Resiliency is everyday coping skills, so we need the adversity in order for us to nurture our skills. So trauma and stress is something that is testing our ability to cope, testing our ability to adjust. And sometimes this is where mental flexibility really becomes an important part of the picture, is how flexible are we in our minds so that we can adapt, or are we being a little bit resistant? The nice thing is that 70% of people do evidence resilience after adversity. That's a really big number. That means that feeling for harmful effects is about 30%. And so 30% are finding difficulties bouncing back, but on the whole, there is a lot of resiliency in the human population. And that is, and for me, it's a nice reminder that we can do difficult things. So let's talk a little bit about the impact that your work has upon you. And we'll start with stress. I kind of look at these 5 sort of areas as a continuum. That's not necessarily how it's presented in literature, but I do sort of look at it as if we aren't taking care of stress, we can lead into burnout and start to sort of have this cost of caring. And it's then not too much to sort of feel that vicarious trauma from the stories that we hear. So we'll start with stress. Okay. So this little picture here is telling us that every day there are a number of stressors that we have to deal with over and above just our job. So getting up in the morning, getting out of bed, getting to work if we're commuting, getting there on time if we are traveling southbound on the 400. If anyone's coming from Barrie ever, I feel your pain because that is a tough ride. And yet somehow everyone is on that and it's always jam-packed and everyone is trying to do the same thing and they're trying to get to work, but this is a stressed moment for a lot of us. Bio kind of chemicals or natural disasters, a lot of things that are not in our control. So every day we're dealing with some sort of stressor with us, with our family members. Someone's fallen sick. We need to provide support. Somebody in our friends may be going through something tough. If you're like me, my furnace just broke. Thank God it's really, really warm right now. And so living environments can test us, and then just our community. If we don't feel like we belong, we kind of have this stress that starts to instill in us. But the thing about stress is that it is quite important for us in order to act. So if we think about child development, nothing beautiful really comes without that pain. And the stress is what initiates, the stress within the body is what initiates the development for the child. And so even kind of to bring a new life in, we need to have a level of stress so that that creation can occur. Without it, we're very lame. And we don't really get out of bed. We don't do the things that we need to do because we don't feel any pressure to do so. Optimum is sort of halfway through, and this is where you are feeling alert, you're feeling decisive, you're able to be focused, and work sometimes feels effortless, but you are able to sort of take what you need and leave what you don't back in the workplace. That is no easy thing to do. But if we don't learn how to separate that a little bit, then we do sort of go into a health breakdown. Stress is becoming an overload on us, and we don't have that chance to really process and really give back to ourselves so that we can continue to give to others. So when you're sort of thinking about it, the comfort area is between in a healthy stress, that we want to sort of keep it in a level where we're active, but we're not overactive to the point where we are reducing how efficient we are at the things that we do. Burnout. So when we focus on giving as an intentional act, we have a lot more control over what we're choosing to give. But a lot of the times we don't have enough control in our workplaces to say, you know what, I can't see this person, I'm just completely exhausted. I've been hearing a lot of trauma stories, and I really need a break. And that can be difficult for us because we may feel that there is an expectation to give to others within our job. And so we may begin to feel a little bit overwhelmed at the thought of completing a task, but also at the thought of just saying no. And that can become really difficult to say, no, I can't do this today, but I will follow up on it, let's say the next day after, to park something. And when we park it, it becomes a little bit of an indication of, do we have to now deal with feelings of guilt for saying no to somebody, or feelings of shame or embarrassment, especially if your image is more about that you are a giver, or that you are someone who is categorized as, oh, you're so helpful, or oh, you always go above and beyond. These become part of our self-image. And so inside, we might be feeling emotionally drained. We might be feeling that, we're just too tired to start the day, or, other people are to blame for their problems because they're not trying hard enough. And this may not be our general disposition towards workplace that we're doing, or the work that we're doing, but it can sort of start to overtake our personal achievements, so that we don't feel that we're accomplishing worthwhile things. We don't feel very effective, and we don't really feel close to our colleagues. And so I relate this back to, if you feel that you're burning out, of a car fuel analogy. So if you can keep your car half full, it's much better for your car, but it's also easier to fill up. It's easier to get to where you want to go without worrying, am I running out of gas? But for humans, we also have to do this to develop our mental immunity. We have to ask ourselves, are we half full, or are we below half full? And do I need to have some kind of check-in to see what kind of mental maintenance do I need for myself, so that I can continue looking after others, but also looking after myself. The next point is compassion fatigue. This is when we kind of move over into the cost of caring. This is where we're not really getting that same pleasure from our careers. So kind of like, oh, I got to go to work today. And that may not have been your initial way of dealing, of kind of waking up in the morning and then going to work. It may have been a little bit more excitement there. There is, in the cost of caring or compassion fatigue, difficulty in feeling empathy for or from others. It's difficult for us to feel fresh or regenerated. So every time we wake up, it's like, oh, I could use a little bit more sleep. I'm still really tired. And we might just be a little bit more irritable. And whether we're not irritable at work, we may be so with the people that are close to us, that we come home to, or we spend a lot of time with. For me, it's my dog and my cat gets my irritability and my anger. But we feel depleted. We feel like our emotions and physical resources have been taken up. And it's that much harder to then give to somebody else. And this just comes back to that car fuel analogy. If we don't have enough fuel, we're not going to get to the place that we want to get to. So I have a bit of a humor here. I hope it doesn't offend anybody, but that is sort of my humor, I guess. And the comic says, it's a new antidepressant. Instead of swallowing it, you throw it at anyone who appears to be having a good time. And so this is, again, where we sort of see that we make these downward comparisons in our social settings, that I'm not really feeling it, but everyone else is having a much better time than I am. And that really kind of plays into the way we think about even our workplace. So other people have a better job than I do, they have more flexibility, and so we start to compare. And sometimes misery loves company, and we kind of want to seek out the people who kind of feel the way that we feel. And that brings me down to vicarious trauma. So this is when we actually start to change our beliefs about the world because of the repeated exposure to trauma, whether we have experienced it ourselves or the client's story, it becomes very difficult to leave it in the environment that you have heard it. So you may have started working with someone from a new perspective, and you go home, and that same story is very difficult to leave behind. And for me, it was one of the stories around the client who did kind of have a stroke 2 weeks after her retirement date. And to me, that was a mental thought that appeared and said, that can happen to you, and yet we work our whole life just to retire, and yet that's not guaranteed afterwards. And it was difficult for me to resonate or reconcile, really, that type of trajectory that can happen for someone who's sort of done everything by the book, and yet the outcome was so different for her. And it was hard not to put that into perspective for myself. So even experiencing someone else's trauma level and then taking it home with you, learning how to park it and then being able to come back to it is a skill that will bolster your resiliency as well. And that leads me to post-traumatic stress disorder. So there is proportions where, for some of us in that 30%, where we do go on to sort of take on the symptoms of the trauma, or we start to avoid, or we start to kind of have difficulties with our sleep. And relating it back to sort of feeling that trauma and that narrative is so much more true for us. And so in brain injury world, we know that if someone loses consciousness at the time they sustain their injury, their likelihood for PTSD is lowered because they don't actually have memory of the traumatic event versus somebody who doesn't lose consciousness and can remember the intrusive thoughts and the flashbacks to that event. So this is sort of that continuum, and this is the impact of the hard work that we do. But it, at any point in time, can shift over to being felt very personal to us. Okay, so let's talk about the real reason you're here, resilience. I love to start this topic off with an analogy of oak trees and willow trees. And if you were at the presentation that I gave back in November, this is a little bit of a repeat for you. But if you were to imagine in a big field, there are two beautiful trees. There's a willow tree and an oak tree. And the willow tree constantly has looked up to the oak tree and admired it for how it stands tall and how it stands strong with its branches up towards the sky and the big leaves that rustle and make a lot of noise. One day a storm comes in through this field, and it is heavy and it is hurtful, and when it's over, the willow tree looks over at the oak and sees that many of its branches have broken and snapped off and have fallen onto the ground. And it sort of wonders, how can this big, strong thing just collapse under the storm, and yet here I am in my entirety, and I'm fine. How am I fine? And the oak sort of replies, I resisted against the wind. I am strong, but I didn't know how to bend with the wind, whereas the willow tree can often bend as it's a droopier tree. And it sways and it dances with the wind, and so it doesn't resist, and it can be flexible towards it. And so sometimes the very thing that we think is an advantage can be a disadvantage. And just allowing ourselves to shift that perspective and ask, in this moment, am I a willow tree, or do I need to be an oak tree, or do I need to be a willow? And that kind of just helps you shift your perspective in terms of, do I need to build my resiliency? Do I need to be flexible here? Or is this something that I really can't find that flexibility for and perhaps seek support at that point? Because we do want to evidence post-traumatic growth, and this is an ability for us to experience the trauma and then create positive personal change out of that trauma. And this sort of sense what that sees the day, that commitment to life. In the brain injury population, the rates of depression in the first year are lower than they are in the second year. And the reason we believe that is because the first year, a lot of people are thankful. They have this renewed appreciation for the fact that they are still continuing it and they didn't pass and that they can do something new. And then the second year is sort of the realization of limitations that might come through. And so for developing resiliency or post-traumatic growth, to be able to experience positive personal changes really results from the struggle to deal with with the trauma itself. We kind of need that in order to evidence the post-traumatic growth. For me, personally, I've witnessed this with my mom and my dad, and sort of so my mom had 7 miscarriages prior to having my brother. And so there's 3 of us. That's quite a bit that she went through a lot of the time. And for her, when my brother was born, it wasn't necessarily a very exciting time. My brother was born with hydrocephalus. He was 2 pounds 9 ounces. He was a premature. And they really thought that he was not going to progress any farther, and they gave him sort of a vegetable diagnosis. And so for my parents, who had waited so long to kind of add to their family, this was now, again, something that was being tested for them, that you kind of have what you want, but you're not going to get all of it. I am thankful to say that my brother did sort of beat the odds, or he did bounce back, and he is now sort of finishing his last year in law school at Thunder Bay. And again, that is a lot of, because I have to say that my mom and my dad did sort of, seize the day with him. All his physio, all of his appointments, it was, this is just what we've got to do, and this is just what we've got to add, and let's continue doing this. And we can really share in globally, in a community, we can really share in the post-traumatic growth. Brings me to one of my favorite analogies of lighthouses and the term self-preservation. I use this term over self-care because self-care can really, for a lot of people, it's I don't have time, or that takes away from something else that I have to do. I don't have time to sit in a bubble bath or go to the gym or, eat well. And a lot of the times that is just because we're in a fast-paced environment, and it is difficult for us to take that time out. But when I start to use the word self-preservation instead, and a lot of the times light bulbs start to go out, and I use the analogy of lighthouses. So lighthouses have been created to warn others that there are the rougher rocks and rougher edges as you're approaching land, and to be very careful sort of as you're doing that. Prior to lighthouses, we couldn't see this, and a lot of the boats would become shipwrecked, and people would pass away. And this is where I would say that lighthouses shine a light on darkness, but we can also build our own mental lighthouses. We can also say, okay, this is where I know I'm starting to go towards more of the darker path, or this is where I'm starting to not take care of myself and not fill up my gas tank. And when those mental lighthouses start to come on, we can then do something about it. But if that awareness isn't there, if those mental lighthouses aren't on, then that becomes a little bit of a difficult task. So I like to say, bring in your friends, your colleagues, your family members, who can also be little mental lighthouses for you, and say, Sam, you never come into the office and just close your door and sit at your desk. Usually you're very chipper and cheery, and you say, hello, is something going on? And this just allows us to recognize that we have self-preservation, but we can also preserve others as well in that way. We do open and we do blossom simply because of others around us, and that energy is really important, that the lighthouses that we have for ourselves can also be lighthouses for others. All right, so how do you do this? How do you take all that information and then actually do something to increase that resilience, whether in yourself or in others? And so this quote kind of starts that and says, courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the judgment that something else is more important than fear. And once you sort of align yourself back to your value system of sort of why you started this work and why you want to engage in this work, then fear sort of isn't as important as that value is. So developing your personal resilience. I'm going to be going through 6 of these domains on the right-hand side here. And before I start to that, I always use the analogy of forests and how resilient forests really are. So the rooted nature of these trees is that they will send distress signals out when there is danger or when there is an attack, or even by other insects. They send a distress signal so that other trees down the road can kind of start to release a sap or engage in some sort of protective mechanism to protect themselves. But it requires a community of connected trees in order to send out a lot of these distress signals. And once they send it, there's something you can do about it. So really knowing that in any of these domains, there is always going to be something we can do. And if we're not sure how to, we can tap into our network and see if there's anyone that's willing to show us how. So let's start with physical. So I paid for a gym membership in October 2018, and it took me until January 2020 to really go consistently. So for a good year and a half almost, I paid for this membership, and I never went. And the first day that I signed up was my last day that I actually went. And the reason for me is I always have an excuse. I always have a reason why I can't exercise. And I have a dog, so we play fetch and we do all these other things, but that high, heavy pace walking isn't happening all the time. So something small we can do is just designate a 20-minute walk. And this can be either in the morning or in the evening or at work on your lunch hour. But the reason you're doing that is because the body really does contain stress. And so by giving yourself one little outlet for 20 minutes is something that you can give back to release a lot of that stress. And dopamine release is so important for us. So I love to equate this to just solving problems. If you have something small that you can solve, let's say just making your bed in the morning, it helps with releasing a bit of dopamine. If we, I love escape rooms, so if you go to an escape room and you can solve the problems, that's the key point. If you don't solve any of them, you're probably not getting much of a dopamine release. It's not fun. But if you can solve these, then you are getting a lot more of a release, and it's just because we are natural problem solvers. Maintaining good sleep, this is so underrated, and I often, when I am working with mental health populations, I often don't like to go into a lot of psychotherapy until sleep is somewhat regulated, because I notice that it complicates a lot of the emotional responses that somebody may have. So setting a regular wake time and a regular sleep time, it sounds super simple, but a lot of us just can't seem to get to that because the events of the day are catching up to us in the evening as well. March is Nutrition Month, so really kind of paying attention to, can you have sort of half your plate with vegetables, and sort of starting small. I'm not somebody who does a lot of vegetables. I'm all about being a carbivore, and if I can eat carbs, I would eat them every day. So for me, the only way that I'm getting mine is by joining a challenge, joining a group of individuals who are working on their nutrition, and it keeps me a little bit more accountable. And then managing your pain, whether it's emotional or physical. And so one of the ways that we want to kind of do this is understanding that suffering is a necessary ingredient for life, right? And because of the suffering, we can also then develop compassion for others. If we've seen suffering or if we've felt suffering, then we can provide that compassion for others who are also going through that. But to also take some time to say, okay, I have to enjoy the little pleasures of life, right? And whether that means that I am in pain and also going out with my colleagues, whether I'm in pain at home or I'm in pain outside, one might give you a little bit of an oomph throughout the day versus feeling very isolated, which then becomes a bit of a vicious cycle. Cognitive, some ways to develop your resiliency here is asking the question, how does this thought actually help me? How does this thought help me get to my goals? And how does this thought help me get farther from my goals? And if it does get me farther, then that is quite an unhelpful thought, and I'm going to park it. I'm going to validate it. I'm going to notice it. So if it says, Sam, you're not really good at what you're doing right now, that thought is going to get parked because it doesn't actually help me finish the goal that I set out to do. So psychological flexibility is your ability to see and adapt in a mental space, sorry, to help you take perspective and shift perspective as it's needed to do so. Goal setting, a lot of people talk about goal setting, so I'm not going to go into too much depth, but I do kind of focus over on the obstacles part. So if you are aware of what your obstacles are, what your blocks are, as you try to commit to your plans, this can be very helpful so that when they appear, you know sort of that you have a plan to deal with it. So for example, if you are trying to work on nutrition and you are starting a new diet, well then really asking yourself, what are the blocks that come when I try to start a new nutritional routine? Is it that I don't have the money to eat organic, or I don't have the money to eat the more expensive nutritional items that I need? Is it that I eventually will always fall off, so once you fall off, it's harder for you to get back on? If you know the block, then you can plan for it. So runners do this really, really well. If they are running a marathon, at some point in that marathon, they are going to hit what's known as the wall. And the wall is a feeling of almost like a fever, your body shutting down. And if you don't know this, you feel like something is happening to you and people stop running that race. But if they are expecting that wall to show up for them as they run, then they can breathe through it, they can finish the race, because they are understanding of the plan that is needed to get through that block. So you can plan your goals in a smart way, but really adding that obstacle block. So for me, it's my block to the gym is often I don't have the time. So the minute I say that, I also then follow it up with, okay, well, where is your time going, and how are you going to manage to get that time? And plan it. So even if I can plan it one day a week, I'd rather have one day at the gym than have no days at the gym, especially if I went a year and a half without it. Just going to go back to that slide. I apologize. So setting realistic expectations and downward comparisons are two that really come in. So research shows that if you are following a lot of individuals on social media who you feel are doing better than you, then our self-esteem drops, our confidence drops. And so my solution, something simple, and a lot of these strategies are just little simple behaviors that you can do that just add a little bit of flexibility towards how you cope with adversity and cope with the trauma. This isn't something that's going to take it all away, but it's just something that allows you, these little behavior changes allow you to bounce back much quicker. So with the downward comparisons in social media, often I say don't follow the people that you know are doing better than you or you perceive are doing better than you, because be very mindful that we only want to show what looks good on social media. But the downward comparison then is following the people that you think you're doing better than. And so that ends up being, again, why social media is such a bit of a control on our self-esteem, because we are constantly being bombarded with unrealistic expectations. And that doesn't leave a lot of room for hope or optimism in that point. So I like to connect that back down to the last point there around your moral compass and your values. If you know what your values are, if you know what your moral compass is, what you stand for in any of these domains, then you aren't going to be very willing to just fall for anything that comes in your way. And so this allows you to become responsive, but it allows you to maintain who you are as an individual at the same time. But part of that is to really understand what is it that you stand for. So in your workplace, what are the values you want to uphold? What are the values you want to uphold as a parent? And what are the values you maybe want to uphold as a citizen living in the country that you are in? Okay, so this is just going to be a skip over, so I do apologize for the back and forth. Okay, so we'll move on to behavioral. Minimizing your multitasking. The brain is not a big fan of multitasking. We do much better if we can limit the amount of distractions that we have around us. So if you are at work and you know there's a lot on your plate to get through, really minimizing how much socialization is happening, all the pinging of your computer and social media apps, and even putting the phone on Do Not Disturb so that the 5 or 10-minute email that you're trying to send will just only take 5 or 10 minutes. This can be, and I understand, very difficult to do when we are working in environments where there are 3 or 4 people in one room. And that, again, becomes a test of our ability. And so part of that is to just either explain or let others know, I'm going to be on a phone call at 12 o'clock. I'm just going to need some space or some quiet. And again, you're sharing your needs with your colleagues here. This also helps you understand what your roles and responsibilities within your workplace are. So if you know what you will and will not do within your work environment, but also within your personal environment, it just allows you to come back in touch with those values that you have. Altruistic behaviors, compassion. So when we give compassion or we see it, we really do feel good as human beings. Just be mindful that sometimes we can this comes back to the cost of caring, we can become a little bit too into giving, and we don't really realize that that same altruistic behavior at some point is something that we need to give back to ourselves, which I know is not the definition of altruism, but it would be important that we also kind of give just as much as we are to others to ourselves. If this is not easy for you, one way you can do this is just stack on a new habit on top of something you're already doing. So if you go to Tim Hortons every morning and that's where you get your morning coffee, when you're about to leave and you're not being rushed out that window, you're really going to just take a moment to say, you know what, I have been trying hard and I am thankful for what I have. And you're just stacking this habit of gratitude onto a habit you're already used to doing. Right? Winning your mornings, it just helps with the dopamine release, and it really helps you just feel like you started your day on the right path. So what we know as well with research is people who just get up a little bit earlier to ease into their morning have a better sort of ability to cope with throughout the day versus that rush that we have in the mornings. And like I said, I understand that this is not easy for a lot of us to have, depending on the environments we wake up in. But even just making your bed is a morning win. Right? Washing the dishes before you go to bed or putting them away is a morning win. And then all of these are just little behaviors we can do to kind of keep moving forward. Emotionally, resiliency can be built by, for me, it's humor. So I've done a new thing where every night I will go to bed watching an episode of Ellen. Just a quick blurb on YouTube just to kind of get that humor and that laughter sort of come in just before I go to bed. This helps me feel grateful for what I have, but it also helps me cultivate these positive emotions. One thing you can do is create a list that you keep, and this sort of just says, these are the behaviors that I know when I engage in them, I do feel positive. And it's of giving yourself permission to be able to do that. In my experience, a lot of my clients will ask me, is it okay if I feel this way? Like, is it okay that I felt angry at the person who cut in line? And often I worry because I don't think anybody else should be giving us permission to feel. These are our emotions, and they are projected out by our own brain, and that we all have every reason to feel whatever emotion comes up. The issue is what we do with those emotions and how we behave with those emotions. So really giving yourself permission to feel, whether it's guilt, whether it's shame, whether it's anxiety or fear, acknowledging that these are very natural humanistic emotions and that they are biologically prepared. And gratitude can also help with sleep. So a lot of our clients will create a gratitude list at night to just help them get to bed on a more positive note. Interpersonal, the point here I really like to focus on is that we have to live life every day. And so the natural way of looking at it is work-life balance, and that we really got to balance the two. But I often say that you need to really focus on life with a little bit of work or with a little bit of other demands and balance with that. That you can't really live life if there is no balance in just that domain. And so this is where your social supports and this is where your opportunities for engagement are really important. We are social animals, and we really need that ability to feel accepted and to feel that we belong to a group. And this can be really important because a lot of people will say, I don't really like groups and I don't really want to go to a group. But this is where we can also share the islands of competence. So I might be talking about resiliency today. Somebody else could be talking about nutrition, and we can really share these different islands of competence. Something that I may not know will come out of somebody else's knowledge transfer. And that is only going to happen in the interpersonal domain. And the barriers to seeking supports comes back to the obstacles with your SMART goals. So really asking yourself, when are you less likely to ask for help? When are you less likely to really seek out support? And identifying what you can actually do in the opposite manner to increase that resiliency for yourself. Spiritual, really addressing our soul wounds or moral injuries. So if something hasn't gone right with the client that you're working with, if something hasn't gone right in the organization that you're working with, instead of sort of letting it go, really addressing that wound, really addressing that injury to the moral compass that may have occurred. So if you work with a demeanor that everybody is everybody can be worked with and somebody comes in and says only certain people can be worked with, that's going to be a difference in values there. And that's going to be a bit of a headbutt between the two perspectives. So really understanding, do I need to reset my moral compass here, or do I need to stand up for my values here? And it just allows you to put yourself back into an assertive standpoint to say, these are my values, and this is how I want to actually compassionately stand up for them. And forgiveness rituals are something that I work a lot with, is to have a little ritual for the things that have not gone right. So sometimes this is you write a letter every night, 5 minutes, you call it a brain dump. And in that 5 minutes, you sort of write out what you forgive, you read it through, and then you go ahead and get rid of that piece of paper to symbolize your forgiveness for that very event. Again, these are just small little behaviors that we can think about in each of these topics to say, what can I do to cultivate optimism? What can I do to cultivate hope? And they're just little behaviors that help you honor the work that you do because of that vicarious trauma that we take on. Altogether, just to sum it up, these are the key areas where I really try to increase my resiliency. So belonging, after going through a couple of changes in my life, is to find groups where I feel like I belong. So not a lot of people have the same friends as they did in kindergarten anymore, or high school, or college. And now it's a lot of the people that we've met through our work. So how much do we feel that we belong, and are we accepted? And shifting perspective. So do we need to shift perspective? It's a hard thing to ask, but sometimes it's to say, okay, do I need more knowledge here? Do I need a knowledge transfer? And this helps with that islands of competence, that we may know something really well about one area, but we may not have that same knowledge in another one, and to be open to receiving that. And just some last, there is a help sheet here just for if anyone is just wanting to do a checklist of self-care for trauma psychotherapists or caregivers or just working in the mental health field. And this checklist does help identify sort of where you feel in terms of your resiliency. So in some ways you can just do it in terms of these domains. It's just what are your personal strengths that lead you to success, really bolstering those strengths, not sort of just putting them on the back burner, because the brain does have a heavy negativity bias. So the minute you make a mistake, it's going to capture that. That's how the brain's been designed to protect us, because back in hunter-gatherer societies, if you didn't look for danger, you're just not here anymore, and neither are your genes. So we really wanted to look out for danger at that point. Now we have a lot more protection, we have a lot of safety, we have healthcare, we have homes that are much safer. So we don't need the negativity bias as much, but it's still there. So to be someone who focuses on strengths, it's a skill that helps with resiliency. We have to really try to do that because it's not natural for us to do so. What experiences in your past have allowed you to overcome adversity? This is just a list that reminds you you can do difficult things and that you can always bounce back, and that it is within your experience to do so. Supportive change, how can you ask for support? And again, this is important. We're social animals, so a lot of us have the mentality that I can do this alone. And we can sometimes, but a lot of times it's just easier if we have a village to support us. And then sense of control, identify where things are out of your control, your locus, and what is within your control, so that if you can do something about it, there is no need to worry. We will figure out a plan and do it. But if there isn't something within your control, then worry is no use. It does not help us get to where we want to go. So really identifying how you want to respond, and do you have the ability to do so, or do you need to cultivate a skill? And those are just some references if anybody was interested in sort of getting more information. A lot of our material is taken from Dr. Meichenbaum. He is our supervising psychologist, so I do pay a lot of respect and honor what he has taught for us there as well. But thank you. So we'll open it up for questions, I guess.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that presentation. That was wonderful. So I think we have about 8 minutes here for questions. So feel free to type your questions into the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. And just a reminder, the webinar has been recorded, so you'll have access to that on the HSKCC website. We will also send out the link to the presentation so you can use that resource as well. So one question that came in during the presentation was from Courtney, and she was asking, in the recent conference that I attended for sexual assault nurses examiners, they talked about empathy fatigue versus compassion fatigue. So she's wondering if that's something you'd be able to touch on.
Empathy versus compassion fatigue?
Yeah, empathy fatigue versus compassion fatigue.
I often will equate the two. I'm not sure if that's, I guess, right in the literature. I haven't really seen it, so I'm not going to speak too much to it. But I would sort of say that it could be more of a continuum. So again, the more you're empathizing and the more that you aren't necessarily being reciprocated, you're eventually that cost of caring, of constantly giving to others or empathizing with others, is going to eventually accumulate at some point if we are not, again, filling that gas tank. But I really would sort of look at it as a continuum as well. Where are you in terms of providing your empathy, and is there that need sort of to take a break so that you aren't taxing that skill, right? Because there are certain brain centers that are connected to empathy, and we just kind of want to be mindful that there is a neural network that's devoted to a lot of compassion as well.
Okay. Thank you. So just waiting here a minute to see if any other questions come in. Feel free again just to type them into the chat box. While we're waiting, I guess I wonder if you have any thoughts on things that workplaces could do or teams could do to kind of support in this area.
Yeah. I think that's a great question, because a lot of the times we see these wellness initiatives start happening in our workplaces, and then we get a couple of emails on wellness, and then all of a sudden it's disappeared. And I think that it kind of speaks to the general way that we think about wellness, is that it's a one-time thing, or oh, I did it for a week, or I did it for a month, and I think that's enough for the next 11 months, right? And so workplaces can really help with, I think, the flexibility of our work environments is important. As employers, I think it's important to acknowledge that if you just don't trust your people, then there's something wrong with that. So to really help individuals understand that a flexible workplace environment is only going to breed back more of this resilient nature as well. And the other thing is, I've been trying to get my team to do this, is sort of these team events, right? And again, I see the team events might happen once a year, but the frequency of them may need to happen a little bit more often. So I've been trying to get my team to an escape room, just because I think it would be awesome to see how we all think so differently, and how could we be placed in a place where we have to really work together to get the outcome that we're looking for. And so I think that's really important. And the other one is just building in respect, a lot more respect in terms of the hierarchy that's in our organizations, so that we can close the gap in terms of seeking support. If we don't feel that we can seek support from our colleagues or our higher ups, then there's going to be that barrier again to actually getting in.
Great. I mean, so it looks like we just have so many positive comments right now, not a lot of questions, but everyone's just saying thank you, and this is a really wonderful presentation. Someone asking if you're open to speaking to smaller groups or other groups.
Yes, definitely we are. I am. I don't know who we is. It's just me. But yes, I am open to speaking. I love speaking. I think it's kind of hard to get me to stop if you ask my students.
Great. Well, I mean, I think it seems like you've given everyone a lot to think about, and a lot of really valuable insights and strategies. Lots of positive feedback again here in the chat box. So if there aren't any other questions, I guess we can wrap things up. So thank you again for joining us today, and thanks to everyone for joining the webinar and signing on this afternoon. Again, we'll make all of these slides and everything available to you afterwards, so stay tuned for that information.
I will leave my email with you as well, just so if anyone did want to ask for any other questions, if anything did come up for them after the fact, then they're more than welcome to reach out via email as well.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great afternoon.